Yes, World Cup semifinals, and you don't want to miss this one. What a drama, what a shocking finish. Chinese Grandmaster Wei Yi, currently ranked 9th in the world, and Russian Grandmaster Andrei Isipenko, ranked 42nd, and both knocked out some top players in the earlier stages of the tournament. Wei Yi is playing white, starts with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, gioco piano, or as some other people call it, Italian defense. c3, preparing d4, knight develops to f6, d3. This is a pianissimo. This is a very quiet, very standard variation. h6, not allowing any pieces on the square. g5, b4, immediately attacking the bishop. Bishop goes away to b6, and a4, and now a5 is on the way to capture the bishop, but obviously Isipenko knows this stuff and plays a6, creating a loft for his bishop to move away if attacked. Short castle for Wei Yi, d6 to develop the light square bishop for Isipenko, knight develops to d2, all standard stuff. Castle, bishop b3, rook e8, and knight jumps to c3. Obviously, Isipenko doesn't want his bishop to be taken, and the pawns doubled, and he moves the bishop away to a7. Bishop e3, offering the exchange of the bishops. Bishop e6, exchange of the bishops on a7. Rook takes a7, and a rook e1. Now, this rook on a7 has nothing to do there, so Isipenko moves it simply to back to a8. Knight e3. The knight is going either to f5 or d5, depending on how the game will go. Queen d7, the rooks are connected. a5 to fixate the pawn structure on the queen side of the board for black. Exchange of the bishops on b3, and knight goes to e7 for Isipenko. In some variations to prepare pawn break with d5. Right now it's impossible because pawn on e5 would be under attack, but that's in future. Rook d1, and now both rooks are in the center of the board for Wei Yi. Knight g6, knight is aiming f4 square, but white is getting to f5 first, knight f5, and now d5. Just notice you cannot take the pawn on d5 because that pawn is protecting the knight on f5. White plays c4. c4, and now the pawn on d5 is under attack. Obviously, exchange of the pawns on e4, and the queen is under attack on d7 by the rook. Queen moves away to c6, and the pawn on e4 now is loose. So queen c2 protects the pawn on e4, no problem. King f8, that move probably is a grandmaster maneuver. Not really sure what exactly accomplishes this move. Maybe under time pressure he decided to just make any move. So king f8 is one of those type of moves. g3 to open the loft for the white king. Rook goes to d8, rook d3, exchange of the rooks on d3, and now the king goes back to g8. Knight d2. In some variations, f4 would be possible, but obviously not right now. Queen d7 offering the exchange of the queens, and Wei Yi says, yes, I'm gonna go to an endgame with you, Andrei. Knight takes on d7, knight b3, knight f8, rook d1, just putting some pressure on the knight on d7. So this knight cannot move anywhere because he has to protect his friend. f6, and b5. b5 is a little dangerous already. If black takes, then white can somehow get a passed pawn going. So king f7, king goes to the middle of the board in the end games. Knight goes to e3, redirecting the knight to a better square d5. We have a rook c8, protecting the pawn on c7 ahead of time. Now knight d5, and rook protects the pawn on c7 already. King e8, and knight b4. After all these maneuvers, white is attacking the pawn on a6 with the pawn and the knight. But black do not pay any attention to this and play knight e6. And here, interesting thing. If you take the pawn on a6 and you take the pawn on a6 with the knight, you lose the game for white, because rook a8 attacking the knight, and after the only move to protect the knight before we have rook b8, and on a skewer one of the knights is gonna be lost. So we're gonna go back to this position, and now you can see that you cannot take the pawn on a6 twice, and instead f3 to protect the pawn e4 in the future. Rook a8 plays Andrei Isipenko. King goes to the middle of the board. Knight c5, exchange of the knights on c5, and rook d5. The knight on c5 is under attack. Andrei plays a knight e6, possibly going to d4. Exchange of the pawns on a6. The pawn on a6 is currently protected by the rook. King goes to e3 and g5, not to allow white to play standard pawn break f4. c5 plays Wei e, and this is the first, not a mistake, I would say, but this is the move that gets white into a very awkward position after a rook b8, because now black controls b file. Attacking the knight takes the pawn on a6, rook a8 attacking the knight goes back, rook takes a5, and not only black gets the pawn back, but also how you gonna protect the pawn on c5. Wei just moves the pawn forward. Obviously, Andrei doesn't want to take the rook here because it will create two connected pawns for white, and he plays a rook a4. Knight again is under attack, and Wei protects it with the move rook b5, knight d4. Now the rook is under attack, check, king e7, another check, king d6, and a mistake. Knight takes f6. How could this be a mistake? Well, it's an extra pawn for white, but not for long. After rook a3 check, king d2, knight takes f3 check, king c2, king takes c6, and all of a sudden black have an extra pawn and a much better position, playing for a win. Rook h6 attacking the pawn on h6, but rook a2 check, king d3, and a rook takes h2, taking the pawn and also protecting the pawn on h6, and now black has two extra pawns. But white has all the chances to save this game. Not with the move knight g4, though. That was another mistake by Wei e. Now Wei e has only 34 seconds to go. Andrei Isipenko has 51. Rook g2, obvious move. Pawn on g3 cannot be protected. White plays knight takes h6. Rook takes g3. Knight f5, attacking the rook. Rook goes back to g2, and with 1 second to go on the clock, 1 second to go on the clock, Wei e plays rook h7. He gets 10 seconds back, and now he has 11 seconds on the clock, but rook h7 is a mistake, because now black could play pretty much any move and control the game, any move with the rook, that is. They had to move the rook somewhere here, rook b2, rook a2, it was all pretty much winning, and then the pawn g goes forward, and then the king goes here, the pawn goes here, but Isipenko rushed. He played king b6 and pretty much lost all his advantage here. He decided, let me move my passing pawn c right away, but it was a mistake. And the reason it was a mistake, because of the next move by Wei e, knight e3. And now the rook is under attack, and now the square d5 is vulnerable. So after the rook moves away, knight d5 check, and the pawn on c7 is gonna be taken by the rook or the knight, and 2 pawns against 1. That would pretty much be a draw. Andrei Isipenko, all the drama right now, because he knows that after the move knight e3 he cannot win anymore, and he panicked, and he, with 25 seconds to go in the game, he decided that that check on d5, he missed it. How you can protect against that check on d5? And he plays c6 to protect the pawn, the square on d5. but the rook is hanging, and Wei Yi immediately, as you can see in this video, takes the rook, and Yesipenko understands what just happened. He forgot to move the rook first and resigned. What a drama, what a shocker. Wei Yi wins the game, goes to the finals, and in the finals, he will play Sandarov from Uzbekistan. Andrei Yesipenko will have to find courage to come back in this tournament and play for the third place tomorrow. But really, this was a dramatic finish to a World Cup. Congratulations to Wei Yi. He is in the finals.